One country is serious about pushing back on big tech censorship. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to celebrate Poland. Poland has done something extraordinary. It is the first country that I'm aware of to propose and introduce legislation that protects the rights of citizens against big tech censors. And it's not surprising that this has come out of Poland. Poland has a strong kind of nationalist, independent sentiment throughout the country. In large part, it's, of course, because of its history of territorial vulnerability. Many times over the centuries, various countries have sought to carve up Poland. And then, of course, most of the 20th century, it was under the thumb of the Soviet Union. And so when Poland obtained its independence, joined the European Union, it was one of the most reluctant parties of the European Union to cede power to Brussels. It seeks to maintain as much authority domestically in its own national government as possible while retaining the benefits of the Shenzhen area, the economic trade, and, of course, NATO membership. But at the same time, young people in Poland, unlike as we would see in Western Europe, in the Anglosphere, young people in Poland are more right-wing than left-wing. It's because the values of liberal democracy, of Western traditions, of freedom of speech, sovereignty of the individual, these are the things that they had to rebel with against Soviet communist oppression. So young people today are perhaps more liberally minded in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe than they are in Western Europe, where they never experienced what it's like to live in a totalitarian society. So they're kind of more open to those elements being introduced at home, let's say. And the Poles have recognized this threat as it pertains to big tech, that they see big tech as the controlling what people can think and say and view, and thus are acting like totalitarian regimes. And that is absolutely true. So what the Poles have introduced is a new legislation to say that any big tech social media platform is subject to massive fines if they censor, block, shadow ban individuals who are expressing their views through social media platforms but are not contravening Polish law in doing so. And the way in which the Polish government has said it is, look, big tech, unelected private companies are not arbiters of people's individual sovereign rights to express themselves freely. That is the role of governments, and any big tech company that seeks to assume the power of a sovereign government will be penalized for doing so. And this is such a self-evidently good law that we as a society decide what individual rights are. And in fact, where rights come from is a matter of debate, but certainly not from big tech companies. And when I think of the kind of free speech expression of the Poles, as I say, it doesn't surprise me. My favorite pianist, for example, is Christian Zimmerman, a notoriously prickly personality and a strong kind of Polish nationalist. And he was playing in the United States many, many years ago. This is during the Bush years. He was playing in the United States and stopped his performance mid-performance to lambast the audience on the missile defense systems that the United States was placing in Poland, to say, get your hands off my country, and to the enormous eye roll, no doubt, of the American audience who just wanted him to play music. But it gives you a sense of the national sovereignty that Poles espouse, because unlike many parts of the West, the Poles have genuine fears about external intervention. And on the other part of the polls, it doesn't surprise me, is that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which we'll get into in our History of Lithuania series a bit more, it was sort of a proto-republic. Unlike the vast majority of Europe during the sort of Baroque period, the number of nobles in Poland was extraordinarily high relative to the population, not nearly as much as 10%, at least tenfold that of much of the rest of Europe. The Schlachter, as they were known, were kind of like the English yeomen. You know, they owned land, but they were otherwise fairly ordinary people. And it was entirely possible to join the ranks of the Polish nobility. And then for most of Polish-Lithuania's history, their monarch was elected, not a matter of hereditary rule, elected by the Schlachter. So there was a sort of a greater sense of democracy and individual rights that applied to the baseline broad politic of the population. And you might think, 10% isn't that much today, but when the American Republic was founded, probably around 10% of the population voted there as well. You didn't have women, you didn't have minorities. It was mostly landed gentry. And so it was a very kind of democratic mentality. And then, but unlike the United States, the Poles had a much greater concern about external interference in their country, and with good reason. And many, many times throughout its history was a partition of Poland because it just happened to sit between massive giants like Germany and Russia and Sweden at that time, and thus was, extraordinarily vulnerable. So they have this strong sense of foreign interference. And in the case of big tech, they see that, of course, as another form of foreign interference where they're trying to impose American Silicon Valley ideas on the Polish population without allowing the Poles themselves to articulate what it is that they value and believe. And so this is an extraordinarily self-evidently good bit of legislation that I wish would be imposed by other countries, replicated by other countries around the world, certainly Australia and Western Europe. We should all say that, social media platforms are the public square. They're not just domains of private companies. You actually do significantly diminish people's ability to express themselves if you to persecute them online. And thus, it's not up to the companies themselves, if they choose to operate within a particular jurisdiction, to impose those restrictions on individual users. People are saying, these are just private companies, they can do what they like. But this attitude is actually really diminishing our ability to participate in civil society. We're seeing this, of course, in financial transactions. People are being blocked from PayPal, they're being blocked from MasterCard. They're not considered individual rights because you can just go, you can just, start your own social media company, your own financial institution if you want to not be deplatformed. And then when they actually tried to do that with Parler, they couldn't do that either because tech media giants, took Parler off the air. So this is a real threat to our ability to have progressive discourse. And as a consequence of that, individuals need to turn to their governments for those forms of regulation. So unlike the Australian sort of approach, which is to force social media tech giants to try and pay money to advertisers from advertising to news corporations, the Poles are talking about individual sovereignty and individual rights. So completely hats off to them. It's not that surprising it's coming out of Poland, but I really would like to see it replicated elsewhere. The only drawback is I think it's going to take a while for the introduced legislation to take effect. I think by January of next year, I think is when it formally takes effect. But also they're introducing a panel of experts, not politicians, but experts, to enforce freedom of speech protection. So I think it's three-fifths majority of the Polish parliament must vote to confirm this panel of experts, and they will be overseeing people's complaints that they receive regarding big tech. So let's say you've been censored from Twitter, you've been censored from Facebook. You can complain to this panel, and if the big tech giants have not satisfactorily resolved the complaints themselves, then this panel can impose massive fines. So they're actually setting up the entire judicial mechanism. And also, big tech will be required to respond within 24 hours if a complaint is made. So let's say, I've been blocked from Twitter for a week or whatever. I can complain to Twitter saying, look, I haven't said anything that violates Polish law online. You do not have the right to censor me based on your own private views. Twitter must respond to that complaint within 24 hours. I mean, how many shadow bans, how many deplatformings, demonetizations have we seen where they just don't respond at all? They just say, oh, you violated our terms of service, end of story. Well, that will no longer be an adequate defense under Polish law. The Poles will have to say, will say, look, you have to cite where in Polish law this individual has violated through their forms of their speech. They've been calling for terrorism, they've been calling for violence. And if Twitter or Facebook are unable to do that, then not only is that individual having their social media accounts restored, but also it is highly probable that they will receive a significant fine for doing it in the first place. It's just such a fantastic, obvious, much-needed bit of legislation, absolute common sense. And it's kind of unbelievable that it hasn't happened elsewhere already. We are seeing certain positive moves in other places, but in a real piecemeal way. So, for example, in the United Kingdom, the Conservative government there under Boris Johnson is appointing a so-called free speech czar to deal with deplatformings at university campuses, because university campuses, unlike private companies, they get all their money from the government, and thus for public universities, Oxford, Cambridge and the like, if they deplatform someone, if they rescind invitations to speak, if they say that people's points of view are not welcome, then they can be penalised through the drying up of government funding for their failure to enforce free speech on campus. And it is absolutely the case that universities are not safe spaces. In fact, they're the complete opposite of that. You'll go there for the purposes of introducing your critical thinking skills, being exposed to other points of view, being challenged on your presuppositions and belief systems in order to be able to compete in the marketplace of ideas, defend your point of view in a rational way. And then if you do have a good idea, if you do have a promising ideology or a set of values that you think improve the society, then you can compete with other forms of ideas, knowing what those ideas are, being armed to be able to articulate those ideas as if those that propose the ideas wish they could do so themselves, in a way to influence public policy and public discourse, as opposed to just picking winners and saying, well, our ideas are right by fiat, and thus anyone else who has a different or opposing ideas, well, they're intrinsically harmful. And thus, university campuses are not a place to open minds, but actually to indoctrinate. And that way, ideology ceases to become, one of a competing marketplace of ideas, and instead becomes a religious dogma. So it is good that in the UK they are starting to push back in terms of the university campuses, but big tech is where the public square is right now. All breaking news is through Twitter. Facebook, that's how people communicate. While the university campus is a good sort of training ground, proving ground for young minds, it does apply to an elite minority, whereas everyday discourse is now happening through the social media platforms. So that's where the biggest regulation requirement takes place. Where it is useful in the university sphere is it is training people to get their degrees to then go off and infect these institutions. And we've seen that all around the world. We see that in New York Times. We've seen that with big tech. We see that with Disney, where people have been indoctrinated with a particular ideology and then take that ideology and enforce it within the major institutions around the world. So that, university is still very important, but I still think the big tech is the biggest issue. But to show just how much this is needed, I think it was the Washington Post published an article that said, it might have been the New York Times, that said critical thinking as we have been trained to do it is no longer useful or helpful in the modern age, i.e. don't engage your own critical thinking. And I think the article went on to say, look, don't go to original sources. Basically, just trust us as the authoritative sources to give you the absolute truth. And the university campuses have gone along with this for far too long, and it's good that that's being pushed back against. But ultimately, the polls are leading the way by saying individuals have a right to express themselves. If they don't contravene Polish law, then then you can't persecute their individual sovereign rights, and we will punish you if you do. So hats off to the Poles. It makes me want to kind of move to Poland, to be honest. I really think that is a critical law. If we were to have a new American Bill of Rights written up today, that would be at the very top. You cannot suppress an individual's right to free speech on any platform if it's a widely used social media platform, unless it contravenes law. That should be a Bill of Rights for the 21st century, because that is a fundamental and inalienable part of the freedom of speech provision of the American Constitution. So that's my view. I'll leave a link in the description to what the polls are doing. If you have any comments on that or any disagreements, do you think this goes too far? Do you think that this could be adapted to other countries in which you live? Do you think it would be not appropriate for your home country? Please have a free and open discourse about that down below, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much.